The mourning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud over democracy itself, and Major Robert Anderson knew that each breath he drew might be among his last. As a United States officer commanding a federal installation from the stone ramparts of Fort Sumter, he surveyed the hostile waters surrounding his small garrison, where Confederate batteries had sprouted like deadly mushrooms along the shoreline. During the winter months of 1860 to 1861, Anderson had never imagined that his military career would culminate in such a precarious position. Born in Kentucky and educated at West Point, he had served with distinction in the Black Hawk War and the Mexican-American War, but nothing had prepared him for the impossible situation he now faced. His orders were clear yet contradictory: hold the fort for the Union while avoiding any action that might provoke the South Carolina forces into open warfare. The political landscape had shifted dramatically since Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860. South Carolina had been the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February, these states had formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. The fracture that had been building for decades over states' rights and slavery had finally torn the nation apart. Fort Sumter occupied a unique and strategic position in Charleston Harbor, built on an artificial island to protect the city from naval attack. The fort's location made it a symbol of federal authority in the heart of the newly formed Confederacy. Anderson had moved his small garrison of fewer than 90 men from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie to Sumter in December 1860, a decision that South Carolina authorities viewed as an act of aggression. The winter months had been a tense game of diplomatic chess. South Carolina demanded the surrender of all federal property within its borders, while President James Buchanan, in his final months in office, struggled to maintain peace while upholding federal authority. The situation grew more complex when South Carolina forces seized other federal installations, including the Charleston Arsenal and Fort Moultrie, leaving Sumter as the last federal stronghold in the harbor. Supply became Anderson's most pressing concern. His men were running low on provisions, and any attempt to resupply the fort would likely be seen as an act of war by the Confederate forces. The merchant ship Star of the West had attempted to deliver supplies and reinforcements in January 1861, but Confederate batteries had fired upon the vessel, forcing it to retreat. This incident had nearly sparked the war 3 months earlier. Then it ultimately began. Throughout the spring of 1861, Anderson found himself caught between his duty to his country and his desire to avoid bloodshed. Many of his officers and men were Southerners themselves, torn between loyalty to their home states and their oaths to the United States Army. The Major understood that his decisions in the coming days would echo through history, potentially determining whether the Union would survive or perish. As April arrived, Anderson received word that a new administration in Washington was preparing to act. President Lincoln had been inaugurated in March, and unlike his predecessor, the new president seemed determined to maintain federal authority over all Union installations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a political crisis into a devastating civil war. President Abraham Lincoln paced the floor of his White House office, the weight of a fracturing nation pressing down upon his tall, angular frame. The Springfield lawyer, who had spoken so eloquently about a house divided against itself, now faced the reality of that division in the most concrete terms possible. Fort Sumter had become the focal point of his presidency, a test of whether the United States government possessed the will and means to preserve the Union. Lincoln's cabinet was deeply divided on the Sumter question. Secretary of State William Seward favored evacuation, believing that a show of conciliation might prevent further secession and eventually bring the departed states back into the Union. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase and Attorney General Edward Bates supported resupplying the fort, arguing that yielding to Confederate demands would legitimize secession and encourage other states to follow suit. The new president found himself walking a tightrope between war and peace. His inaugural address had attempted to strike a conciliatory tone, declaring that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, while firmly stating that the Union was perpetual and that secession was legally impossible. However, words alone could not resolve the crisis at Charleston Harbor. Military advisors presented Lincoln with stark realities. General Winfield Scott, the aging hero of the Mexican-American War who served as commanding general of the United States Army, recommended evacuating Fort Sumter. Scott argued that the fort was militarily untenable and that attempting to hold it would require a massive military effort that the country was not prepared to undertake. The general's assessment was purely tactical, but Lincoln understood that the decision carried profound political implications. According to historical accounts from the New York Tribune, Lincoln spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, knowing that either course of action might precipitate the very war he hoped to avoid. The president's private secretary, John Hay, later recorded that Lincoln appeared to age years in the span of weeks as he grappled with the Sumter crisis. The strategic importance of Fort Sumter extended beyond its military value. The fort represented federal authority in the South, and its surrender would signal to the world that the United States government could not enforce its will within its own borders. European powers were watching the American crisis with keen interest, and any sign of weakness might encourage foreign intervention or recognition of the Confederacy. Lincoln's political calculations were equally complex. The Republican Party had elected him on a platform of preventing slavery's expansion into new territories, and his core supporters expected him to take a firm stand against secession. However, the president also needed to consider the loyalty of the border states Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which remained in the Union but contained significant pro-Confederate populations. The president's decision-making process was further complicated by the limited intelligence available about Confederate intentions and capabilities. Reports from Charleston suggested that Confederate forces were strengthening their positions around the harbor, but the extent of their preparations remained unclear. Lincoln needed to determine whether the Confederates were merely posturing or genuinely preparing for war. As March turned to April, Lincoln made his fateful decision. He would attempt to resupply Fort Sumter with provisions only, not reinforcements or additional weapons. The president believed this approach would maintain federal authority while avoiding any action that could be construed as aggressive. He notified Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina of his intention, hoping that transparency might prevent a violent confrontation. The president's decision reflected his fundamental belief that the Union was worth preserving, even at the cost of war. Lincoln understood that backing down at Sumter would establish a precedent that might doom the United States to gradual dissolution. The choice between peace and principle had been made, and the consequences would soon unfold in Charleston Harbor. Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard stood atop the parapet of Fort Johnson, his keen eyes surveying the ring of Confederate batteries that now encircled Fort Sumter like a steel noose. The Louisiana-born officer, a former student of Major Anderson's at West Point, had been tasked with the most delicate military operation in the young Confederacy's brief existence, forcing the surrender of the federal garrison without providing the Lincoln administration with grounds to claim Southern aggression. Beauregard had arrived in Charleston in March 1861 with explicit instructions from Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The federal fort could not be allowed to remain in Union hands, as it represented a dagger pointed at the heart of the Confederacy's most important Atlantic port. However, Davis was equally concerned about the political implications of firing the first shot in what might become a prolonged conflict. The Confederate commander faced a complex tactical situation. Fort Sumter occupied a nearly impregnable position in the middle of Charleston Harbor, its thick masonry walls designed to withstand naval bombardment. The fort's pentagonal shape and multiple tiers of guns made it a formidable defensive position. Even with Anderson's limited garrison, any assault would require careful coordination between multiple battery positions to be effective. Throughout March and early April, Beauregard supervised the construction and strengthening of Confederate positions around the harbor. Fort Moultrie, which Anderson had evacuated in December, was reoccupied and its guns trained on Sumter. Additional batteries were established at Cummings Point, Fort Johnson, and the floating battery, a unique armored structure that could be positioned to provide enfilade fire along Sumter's walls. The Confederate preparations were methodical and thorough. Engineers surveyed angles of fire and calculated the most effective positions for different types of artillery. Smoothbore cannons, rifled guns, and mortars were positioned to create a devastating crossfire that would make Fort Sumter's position untenable. The Confederates possessed approximately 50 guns of various calibers, far outnumbering the federal fort's armament. South Carolina's political leaders watched the military preparations with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Governor Francis Pickens and other state officials had been among the most vocal advocates for secession, but they also understood that war would bring unpredictable consequences. The state's economy depended heavily on cotton exports through Charleston, and a prolonged conflict would disrupt this vital trade. The Confederate forces assembling around Charleston Harbor represented a cross-section of Southern society. Wealthy plantation owners served alongside yeoman farmers, united by their belief in states' rights and their opposition to federal coercion. Many of these men had no previous military experience, but they compensated for their lack of training with enthusiasm and determination. Beauregard's own position was complicated by his personal relationship with Major Anderson. The two men had maintained a cordial correspondence, even as political tensions escalated, with each expressing hope that their professional disagreement would not destroy their personal friendship. This relationship would add a poignant dimension to the coming confrontation. As April progressed, intelligence reports suggested that the Lincoln administration was preparing to resupply Fort Sumter. Confederate spies in Washington and New York monitored federal preparations, while Southern sympathizers in the federal government provided additional information about Union intentions. The prospect of a relief expedition added urgency to Confederate planning. The Confederate strategy was straightforward: demand the surrender of Fort Sumter, and if refused, bombard the fort until Anderson's garrison could no longer resist. Beauregard believed that a sustained artillery barrage would force the federal commander to capitulate without excessive loss of life on either side. The Confederate general hoped to achieve his objective through intimidation rather than slaughter. By early April, the Confederate ring around Fort Sumter was complete. More than 4,000 Confederate troops occupied positions around Charleston Harbor, while additional forces remained in reserve. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine whether the secession crisis would be resolved through negotiation or violence. The morning of April 11, 1861, dawned clear and bright over Charleston Harbor, but Major Robert Anderson felt the approaching storm as surely as if dark clouds had gathered overhead. His provisions were nearly exhausted, his men were tired and anxious, and the Confederate battery surrounding his position had grown stronger with each passing day. The federal garrison at Fort Sumter was now completely isolated, dependent on whatever resolution the politicians in Washington and Montgomery might reach. Anderson had been exchanging messages with General Beauregard throughout the early days of April, maintaining the courteous tone that had characterized their relationship despite the extraordinary circumstances. Both men understood that they were participants in a drama larger than themselves, representatives of irreconcilable political philosophies that had finally reached the point of armed confrontation. The Confederate commander had received his final instructions from Montgomery on April 10th. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet had decided that Fort Sumter must be surrendered before any federal relief expedition could arrive. The Confederate president had authorized Beauregard to demand the fort's evacuation and, if necessary, to use force to secure compliance. The decision reflected the Confederate leadership's belief that their new nation's credibility depended on establishing effective control over its claimed territory. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 11th, 3 Confederate officers approached Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Chisholm carried General Beauregard's written ultimatum to Major Anderson. The document was formal and courteous, but its meaning was unmistakable: surrender the fort or face bombardment. Anderson received the Confederate representatives in his quarters, offering them the hospitality that military tradition required even in such circumstances. The federal commander read Beauregard's demand carefully, understanding that his response would likely determine whether the sectional crisis would be resolved through negotiation or violence. The weight of history pressed upon every word of the exchange. The major's response was dignified but firm. He acknowledged the Confederate position, but stated that he could not surrender the fort without orders from his superiors in Washington. Anderson's reply was both professional and personal, expressing his regret that former comrades now found themselves in opposing positions. The federal commander requested time to consider the ultimatum, hoping that additional negotiations might prevent bloodshed. As the Confederate delegation returned to their headquarters, Anderson convened his officers to discuss their situation. The fort's supplies were critically low, with only a few days' worth of provisions remaining. The garrison's ammunition was adequate for a short engagement, but a prolonged bombardment would quickly exhaust their resources. Most significantly, the fort's construction had never been completed, leaving gaps in the defensive walls that would be vulnerable to Confederate fire. Throughout the evening of April 11th, frantic negotiations continued between the two sides. Confederate authorities offered to allow Anderson's garrison to depart with full military honors, If the fort were surrendered peacefully, the federal commander was tempted by this offer, as it would spare his men's lives while maintaining their dignity, but he felt bound by his oath to hold the fort until relieved or ordered to withdraw. The night brought little rest to either side. Confederate gunners made final preparations for the bombardment, while Anderson's men strengthened their positions as much as possible. The Federal garrison was pitifully small for such a large fort, with many gun positions unmanned and significant portions of the walls undefended. The coming battle would test not only military capabilities, but also the courage and determination of both sides. As dawn approached on April 12th, Anderson knew that his time had run out, the Confederate ultimatum had expired, and no Federal relief expedition was visible on the horizon. The Major had done everything possible to avoid the confrontation, but the political forces that had brought the nation to this point were now beyond any individual's control. The first battle of the Civil War was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of America would commence. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the darkness above Charleston Harbor was shattered by the brilliant arc of a mortar shell climbing toward Fort Sumter. The projectile, fired from Fort Johnson by Captain George James, exploded directly above the Federal fort, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. The sound of that first explosion would echo through for years of unprecedented bloodshed and national transformation. Major Anderson and his garrison had been awake since before dawn, manning their positions and preparing for the bombardment they knew must come. The Federal commander had positioned his limited forces to provide the best possible defense of the fort, though he understood that his situation was essentially hopeless. With fewer than 90 men to defend a fort designed for a garrison of 600, Anderson could only hope to maintain his position until relief arrived or his ammunition was exhausted. The Confederate bombardment began in earnest as the sun rose over the harbor. General Beauregard had coordinated the fire from multiple positions to create a devastating crossfire that would make Fort Sumter's position untenable. The floating battery, Fort Moultrie, Cummings Point, and other positions opened fire in sequence, their shells screaming across the water to crash against the Federal fort's walls. Captain Abner Doubleday, who would later gain fame as a Union general, fired the first shot in response to the Confederate bombardment. The Federal artillery replied with spirit, though Anderson had ordered his men to conserve ammunition and avoid unnecessary casualties. The Major understood that his primary mission was to maintain the Union's presence in Charleston Harbor for as long as possible, not to inflict maximum damage on the Confederate forces. The bombardment continued throughout the day, with both sides maintaining a steady rate of fire. The Confederate shells gradually took their toll on Fort Sumter's defenses, knocking out several guns and damaging the fort's walls. However, the thick masonry construction proved remarkably resilient, and the Federal garrison continued to return fire despite the overwhelming odds against them. One of the most dramatic moments of the battle occurred when Confederate shells set fire to the fort's wooden barracks. The flames spread rapidly, filling the enclosed space with smoke and threatening to reach the magazine, where the fort's gunpowder was stored. Anderson's men fought desperately to control the blaze while continuing to man their guns, displaying the kind of courage that would characterize both sides throughout the coming war. The fire created a crisis that nearly forced Anderson to surrender earlier than he had planned. The smoke became so thick that the Federal gunners could barely see their targets, and the heat grew intense enough to threaten the fort's ammunition supply. Several times during the day, it appeared that the garrison might be forced to abandon their positions, but Anderson's men managed to control the flames and continue their resistance. As the day wore on, it became clear that Fort Sumter could not hold out indefinitely. The Confederate fire was having a cumulative effect, gradually destroying the fort's defensive capabilities. While the Federal garrison's ammunition supplies dwindled, Anderson made the difficult decision to cease firing from most of his guns, conserving his remaining ammunition for a final gesture of defiance. The political dimension of the battle was as important as its military aspects. Both sides understood that they were participating in a symbolic confrontation that would determine the future of the American nation. The Confederate forces needed to demonstrate their ability to enforce their authority within their claimed territory, while the Federal garrison needed to show that the Union would not yield to threats of violence. Throughout the bombardment, crowds gathered along the Charleston waterfront to watch the historic battle. Many spectators treated the event as a form of entertainment, bringing picnic lunches and cheering when particularly spectacular explosions occurred. Few observers understood that they were witnessing the beginning of a conflict that would ultimately claim more than 600,000 American lives died as evening approached on April 12th. Both sides prepared for what they expected would be the final phase of the battle. The Confederate bombardment had achieved its tactical objectives, rendering Fort Sumter's position untenable. While Anderson's garrison had demonstrated their courage and determination, the stage was set for the climactic events that would conclude this historic confrontation. The morning of April 13, 1861, brought with it the bitter reality that Major Anderson's valiant defense of Fort Sumter had reached its end. The Federal commander surveyed the damage that 34 hours of continuous bombardment had inflicted upon his position. The fort's walls were breached in several places. Most of the guns were disabled, and the wooden structures within the fort had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Most critically, the garrison's ammunition was nearly exhausted, making further resistance futile. Anderson faced the most difficult decision of his military career. His orders had been to hold the fort, but continuing the fight would serve no purpose beyond ensuring the deaths of his men. The Federal commander had proven that the Union would not yield to Confederate demands without a fight, but the tactical situation made surrender inevitable. With a heavy heart, Anderson ordered the American flag to be lowered and a white flag of truce to be raised in its place. The Confederate response to Anderson's surrender offer was immediate and magnanimous. General Beauregard, who had maintained his respect for his former instructor throughout the bombardment, offered the Federal garrison the honors of war. Anderson's men would be allowed to salute their flag, march out with their arms and personal property, and depart for the North aboard a Federal vessel. The generous terms reflected both military tradition and Beauregard's personal regard for his opponent. The formal surrender ceremony took place on April 14, 1861, exactly 4 years before Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated. Anderson's men were permitted to fire a 50-gun salute to their flag before lowering it for the final time. Tragically, an accidental explosion during the salute killed Private Daniel Huff and mortally wounded Private Edward Galloway, making them the first casualties of the Civil War during what should have been a peaceful ceremony. The evacuation of Fort Sumter marked the end of Federal authority in South Carolina, but it also provided the Lincoln administration with the justification it needed to respond to Confederate aggression. The president had skillfully maneuvered the Confederates into firing the first shots of the war, allowing him to present the Union cause as defensive rather than aggressive. This political advantage would prove crucial in maintaining Northern support for the war effort. News of the Fort Sumter bombardment spread rapidly throughout the nation via telegraph, creating dramatically different reactions in the North and South. Northern newspapers denounced the Confederate attack as an act of unprovoked aggression against the Federal government, while Southern publications celebrated the victory as proof of their new nation's determination to defend its sovereignty. The battle had achieved what months of political maneuvering had failed to accomplish. It had crystallized public opinion on both sides. President Lincoln's response to the Fort Sumter crisis was swift and decisive. On April 15, 1861, he issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and reclaim federal property. The president's action transformed the secession crisis into a full-scale war, as states were forced to choose between supporting the federal government or joining the Confederacy. The call for volunteers triggered a second wave of secession that brought from more states Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina into the Confederacy. These states had previously rejected secession, but Lincoln's military response convinced their leaders that neutrality was no longer possible. The addition of these states, particularly Virginia with its industrial capacity and military tradition, significantly strengthened the Confederate cause. The Battle of Fort Sumter had profound implications for American foreign relations. European powers had been watching the American crisis with great interest, and the outbreak of war created new opportunities for foreign intervention. The Confederate government hoped to secure recognition and support from Britain and France, while the Lincoln administration worked to prevent foreign involvement in what it insisted was a domestic insurrection. The surrender of Fort Sumter also had personal consequences for the officers and men who participated in the battle. Major Anderson became a hero in the North, symbolizing federal determination to preserve the Union. General Beauregard's reputation was enhanced by his skillful conduct of the bombardment, establishing him as one of the Confederacy's most promising military commanders. The battle had launched both men toward larger roles in the coming war. The transformation of the sectional crisis into civil war was now complete. What had begun as a political dispute over slavery and states' rights had become an armed conflict that would test the very survival of the American nation. The shots fired at Fort Sumter had awakened forces that would reshape the country in ways that few contemporaries could have imagined. The smoke had barely cleared from Charleston Harbor when the full magnitude of what had occurred at Fort Sumter became apparent to leaders on both sides of the growing conflict. The bombardment and surrender of the federal fort had transformed a political crisis into a military confrontation that would engulf the entire nation, the United States of America, which had existed as a single entity for 85 years, was now divided into two hostile camps prepared to settle their differences through force of arms. President Lincoln's call for volunteers met with an enthusiastic response throughout the North. Young men flocked to recruiting stations, inspired by patriotic fervor and confident that the rebellion would be crushed within a few months. The initial enthusiasm was so great that many volunteers had to be turned away, as the federal government lacked the infrastructure to equip and train such large numbers of recruits. The prevailing sentiment was that one decisive battle would restore the Union and bring the wayward states back into the fold. The Confederate response was equally dramatic, but reflected different motivations and expectations. Southern leaders portrayed the conflict as a second American Revolution, with the Confederacy fighting for independence against an oppressive federal government. The comparison to 1776 resonated strongly with Southern audiences, who saw themselves as defending their homes and way of life against foreign invasion. Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders worked to transform regional grievances into a unified national cause. The military implications of the Fort Sumter crisis extended far beyond the immediate participants. Both sides faced the enormous challenge of creating armies from largely civilian populations, establishing supply systems, and developing strategies for a conflict whose scope and duration remained unknown. The regular United States Army numbered fewer than 16,000 men scattered across frontier posts and coastal fortifications, while the Confederacy had no national army at all when the war began. The political consequences of Fort Sumter reverberated throughout the remaining United States, forcing citizens and leaders to make fundamental choices about their loyalties. The border states Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware became critical battlegrounds where families and communities were torn apart by conflicting allegiances. The decision of these states to remain in the Union or join the Confederacy would significantly influence the war's outcome. According to documentation preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the weeks following Fort Sumter saw frantic preparations on both sides as political leaders grappled with the reality of civil war. The bombardment had resolved the immediate crisis of federal authority in Charleston Harbor, but it had also unleashed forces that neither side could fully control or predict. The international dimension of the American crisis became increasingly important as news of Fort Sumter reached European capitals. British and French leaders watched American developments with great interest, recognizing that the disruption of the United States might create opportunities for European influence in North America. The Confederate government immediately began seeking foreign recognition and support, while the Lincoln administration worked to prevent European intervention in what it insisted was a domestic rebellion. The economic implications of the war were also becoming apparent as the conflict began. The North possessed significant advantages in industrial capacity, railroad networks, and financial resources, while the South depended heavily on agricultural exports, particularly cotton. The Confederate strategy relied partly on the assumption that European dependence on Southern cotton would force foreign intervention on their behalf, a calculation that would prove critically flawed. The human cost of the transformation from political crisis to civil war was already evident in the aftermath of Fort Sumter. Families were divided, friendships were destroyed, and communities were torn apart by conflicting loyalties. The accidental deaths during the surrender ceremony had provided a tragic preview of the suffering that would characterize the next 4 years of American history. As the nation prepared for war in the spring of 1861, few participants understood the magnitude of the conflict they were beginning. The Battle of Fort Sumter had been a relatively bloodless affair, lasting only 34 hours and resulting in no combat deaths. However, the political and psychological impact of the bombardment had been enormous, transforming a constitutional crisis into a war that would ultimately claim more than 600,000 American lives and reshape the nation's fundamental character. The shots fired at Fort Sumter had indeed turned tensions into full-scale civil war, but they had also begun a process of national transformation that would extend far beyond the military conflict itself. The preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery would require for years of unprecedented sacrifice. But the foundation for both achievements had been laid in Charleston Harbor during those fateful days of April 1861.